I'm delighted to be here with Seamus. I feel like I met Seamus long before I met him, because when I was the restaurant critic for the Times, I was fortunate enough to eat in and review 2 of his restaurants, which I liked very, very much. And I was a big fan of Seamus, and then after I left the job and I could cease being incognito or whatever, we actually met. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to him here. And those of you who know him probably we'll talk about a lot of stuff you do know. Those of you who don't, I'm happy to help you get to know him better, because he's a fascinating guy. His book, Hero Food, is not your typical recipe book or cookbook or food book, and there's some serious reasons for that. There's a serious backstory to it, and we'll get to that, but I thought we'd begin on kind of lighter, more general food notes. So for starters, Seamus, how does a guy who grew up in Vermont and has a last name that doesn't sound particularly Spanish to me become a Spanish food aficionado, evangelist, etc.?
Adoption. No, I did grow up on a small farm in Vermont, and this chair is really odd. Does it kick back a little bit? Is this a recliner? Forgive me for getting comfortable. I did grow up on a small farm in Vermont, and I wasn't a terribly good student. I really actually didn't like school at all. But the one thing that I did do quite well at was Spanish, my Spanish language class. And I had a very, very supportive teacher who encouraged me to go to Spain to kind of keep from dropping out of school. And I was involved in an exchange program my senior year in high school. And that really, I mean, getting there was just a huge eye-opening experience. It was a major change from where I had grown up, and I was exposed to food and to culture and architecture and things that I'd never seen before. And I really fell in love with the country, and that became kind of the beginning of what has been now a 20-some-odd year love affair with the food and the culture of Spain. And I started returning over and over again. And I went back to Spain for 2 years of college, and I went back and cooked in Spain. And it's become a huge part of my life. And I really can't imagine doing what I do if it weren't sort of pushed by the culture and the cuisine of Spain.
In a world of so many fine cuisines, and Europe, a continent of so many fine cuisines, what do you think is distinctive and peerless about Spanish food?
I think one of the remarkable things about Spanish food, and everybody, of course, is familiar with the explosion of the vanguard of Spanish cuisine, is that Spain, because it came out of 40 years of an oppressive regime under Franco, it wasn't really it wasn't bridled by the same sort of I don't know, dogma or kitchen culture that France was. So there was an ability to kind of say, well, we can break the rules and we can do whatever we want, and this is how we do it. And so much of Spanish cuisine, it has a very rich culinary culture, but so much of Spanish cuisine is really born out of necessity and born out of poverty, and all of these elements of, I mean, Spain is famous for its cured foods, whether it's cured meats or it's cheese or salt cod. So many of these things are obviously no longer important or necessary, but they're the cornerstones of what Spanish cuisine has come to be, and the flavor profiles of Spanish cuisine, and it just makes it so very different from the other cuisines of Europe, that it's really about necessity, and so there's this really interesting kind of dichotomy between the avant-garde and the very, as I said, the unbridled kind of forward-thinking gastronomy of Ferran and his whole school, and then this very old world, rootsy kind of cuisine that you see in the other extreme of Spain, and it really makes a very interesting place to eat. And to learn about food.
You opened Boqueria in what year? 2005, 2006?
2006, yeah.
Before then, did you get to do much Spanish cooking in American kitchens?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. When I came back from Spain in 2004, from working in Spain, and I worked in Midtown with Julian Alonso at Brasserie 8½, and he was he had been going to Spain for 10 years for inspiration, and so he was really interested in incorporating the stuff that I had learned in Spain into the menu. So we did a lot of stuff that was not overtly Spanish. The restaurant was intended to be a French-inspired restaurant, but there was an overt Spanish accent in a lot of the food that we were doing there, largely because of the time that he had spent traveling in Spain, and of course the years that I had spent living there.
Why do you think Spanish food has never, I mean, it's certainly been celebrated over recent years, but why do you think it's never had quite the commercial traction in this city or in this country that French did and that Italian now does?
Well, I think the major difference between Spanish food and certainly Italian food is that Italian food has a sort of a ready-built network of distribution. There's an Italian community, a strong Italian community throughout the United States that's been here for, in many cases, over 100 years. So there's a familiarity with a lot of the foods and products. But I also think that Spain, in so many ways, is a very young country, as a modern country, is a very young country. In the past 15 years, they've been going through a lot of the immigration issues that other parts of Europe went through 50 years ago. They're wrestling with a lot of things that are very new to them. And Spain hasn't really entirely figured out how to communicate its cultural wealth to the rest of the world. So when you look at, I mean, the Italians and the French do a terrific job of packaging foods. The Spanish have been always kind of somewhat behind that. So there's, they just haven't had the same sort of, they haven't had they're 50 years behind every other country in that sense, because it's relatively new to the markets outside of Spain. But they also haven't had the same sort of development of products within the country. And there's also an element of wanting to preserve what they have for themselves. There's a real pride, and of course there's also the famous siesta in the afternoon that, they're not necessarily the most proactive when it comes to pushing their culture. They're very happy with what they have. So, but now I think with the recession, they're certainly seeing the necessity of trying to get what they have out to to greater markets.
Is there, I mean, outside of Tertulia, are there more good Spanish restaurants in this city than we realize if we know where to look? I ask that because I imagine we've got a lot of fervent restaurant goers here who'd love to leave with a list of 5 places to check out. Yeah, well, there really aren't that many Spanish restaurants in New York. There's a lot of the old guard Spanish restaurants that have been around since the 50s and 60s, which are pretty traditional in a lot of ways. And you mean what when you say that? Which restaurants are you thinking of? Well, things like Sevilla and El Quijote and these sort of old guard Spanish restaurants that are great for their kitsch factor, not necessarily for their kitchen factor. But there are a handful of newer restaurants, and certainly Alex Raj, who has she's got 3 restaurants now. I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. She and her husband Etta are both beautiful cooks, and they do really great food. But there really aren't that many Spanish restaurants in New York. And if you think about it, there's for every Spanish restaurant, there's 5 French and 20 Italian restaurants. So it's growing slowly. I was going to say, do you think we'll see more of it in the coming decade, despite all of the historical realities and dynamics you mentioned? Yeah, I think there's, as I said, there's a growing interest. It's still, I find that Spanish food is largely misrepresented, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Spanish food is, and it sort of goes back, obviously, to early misconceptions about Spanish food being lumped in with Latin American cuisine, or is it spicy? I don't like spicy food. Well, Spanish food is not very spicy. I mean, it's really there are a lot of old misconceptions about that, and now there's a lot of sort of the focus on the avant-garde and the modernist movement. What really interests me is this fertile middle ground of Spanish cuisine that is very, very unrepresented outside of Spain, which I find to be fascinating. In Spain they call it cocina de producto, which means product-based cooking. You were how long into your tenure at Boqueria when you encountered the health problem that became the sort of building block of this book? It wasn't a health problem. Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, I think that. So I have rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease, and I was diagnosed about a little less than a year into the opening of Boqueria. But I think it was something that I had been wrestling with for a really long time, and I just didn't know it. It was slowly building up. And can you tell us the story of how you ended up with the diagnosis? Sure. Yeah. Rheumatoid arthritis is an inflammatory disease that essentially your immune system goes haywire and you attacks your own joints, and it can manifest itself in a number of different ways. For me, leading up to my diagnosis, I would have moments of attacks in my shoulder or in my hip or in my knee where the joint would swell up and become incredibly painful, and
So I'd go to the doctor, I'd go to the hospital, they'd give me x-rays and find nothing wrong with me and send me home, and 2 days later it would go away. And this would happen over and over and over again. And eventually it happened in my left hip, and it was just excruciatingly painful. And I ended up being hospitalized for about 10 days while they tried to figure out what was going on with me. And it was, my white blood cell count was through the roof, and my hip was full of fluid. And at one point they thought I had a septic hip, and they were going to try to do what's called a hip evacuation, where they basically cut open your pelvis and scrub it out, which fortunately, thanks to my brother, who was my healthcare proxy, said, we're not going to do this. We need to make sure that there's really an infection there. And of course there wasn't an infection. And that's when I was finally diagnosed by the Department of Rheumatology. They saw that I had what appeared to be an infection, tremendous inflammation, but there was no infection. And that's kind of a classic presentation of RA. And unfortunately, particularly for children who suffer from juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, it's extremely difficult to diagnose. It's not the sort of thing where there's one test and you have RA. It's really kind of a spectrum of tests that have to be, that kind of compromise the diagnosis. And it's kind of a moving target too, because the disease can present itself and then disappear, and that's something that we're going to talk about with the book. How it presents itself has a lot to do with how we treat ourselves, whether they're environmental factors or dietary factors. They can affect how the disease behaves, and then make it extremely difficult at times to diagnose.
When you got the diagnosis, what were you told, or what did you fear would be the impact on your career as a chef?
It was one of those moments that was really first that Dr. Fisher, who was the chair of rheumatology at Beth Israel, he was wonderful, and he said, listen, I want to let you know that you have a disease called rheumatoid arthritis, which I'd never even heard of. And he said that he was going to, over the next few days, he'd be talking me through sort of what that meant and what I could expect now that I'm going to be living with this disease, which I had actually been living with for quite some time. And he left the room, and I immediately grabbed my BlackBerry and I started, Googling it, which obviously you shouldn't do anytime you have a medical condition, because you'll end up with the worst news possible. And immediately I learned that I was never going to walk again. I was never going to cook again. I was never going to be able to work again, and that my life was going to be over. So it was pretty devastating, and learning all of those things that were obviously not true. But I really did think that it would affect my life, and it has, obviously. But I thought it was going to, I thought my life as I knew it, I was in a position in which, I had just opened my first restaurant, and my career seemed to be on a great path, and I was going in a great direction. I was living my dream, and suddenly it was like having the rug pulled out from underneath me. So it was devastating in a lot of ways. But as I learned over time, it really didn't have to be as devastating as I thought it was.
How long did it take you through medication, and we'll get to the diet and food stuff, how long did it take you to manage it so that you weren't physically challenged or in physical pain when you were standing, working? Kitchen work is physical work. Yeah?
Kitchen work is physical work. Yeah. It still is. It's something that I deal with all the time. I have days that are horrible days, and I have days that aren't so bad. But it's certainly the first, after that initial flare-up, which was really dramatic, the first 5 months were really, really tough. It was hard going to work. It was hard being at work. It's also hard because from the outside, I certainly don't look like, I'm not in a wheelchair. I don't look like an unhealthy person. So there's an element of feeling as though maybe I'm just being a hypochondriac, or this kind of insecurity that other people might be judging me that I can't do something, or that I have to go home early, or whatever the case may be. And that's something that's very difficult for people that deal with autoimmune diseases. You at the outside, you can appear to be very healthy, and you can actually be killing yourself if you're not respecting your own health.
What was how long did it take to get the right medications, and when did you start to kind of say medication might not be the answer, I have to deal with diet?
Well, I mean, I went through a number of different medications, and when I found that, and there are a few different ways of treating RA. Some of the drugs that are called biologic drugs are immunosuppressant drugs. They alter your immune system. Other drugs, more traditional drugs like prednisone and methotrexate, which are very powerful drugs, obviously have secondary effects that are quite unpleasant. And I found that for most of the treatments that I went through, drug treatment, there'd be an effective period where the drugs would work quite well, and I would suddenly feel like I had my life back. And then slowly they would sort of stop working and taper off as my body became either used to the drug, or secondary effects from the drug made things even more miserable. And eventually what happened, I started having lots of secondary effects because of the drugs, including at one point, as I mentioned to you earlier, I had a seizure, I had never had a seizure before, and that was very, very scary, and it was a huge wake-up call. And then that was followed by a very severe bacterial infection in my brain that was, nearly fatal. And that's when I realized, listen, I need to do anything and everything I can to get off of medication, because the risks really for me were too high.
And had no doctor or anyone said to you during that period, let's also talk about issues of diet, let's talk about food, or was that something you had to kind of figure out on your own? It's interesting. I found that to a large degree in Western medicine, there's this notion that, okay, well, if that works for you, if diet works for you, go ahead and do it. Or if yoga is good, go ahead, yeah, that's fine. But there isn't like this, for the most part, I mean, there certainly are a lot of doctors that do look at the whole picture, but my experience with Western medicine has really not been that kind of systemic overview of let's take a look at all the different parts and let's piece things together and see what we can do as an overall program that might affect how you feel and how the disease behaves. And ultimately, I kind of came to it through the support of my friends and family and on my own, but it really wasn't. It's never been something that the medical community that I've been involved with has said, this is really important, you need to focus on this, you should try incorporating more of this into your diet, or try doing more of this. So it was you who said to yourself, I wonder if I should change the way I eat, I wonder if that can have an impact.
Initially it came from my mother, and as a good mother, she said,
as food things tend to, yeah.
Exactly. My mother and my grandmother both said, listen, you need to, and my mom started sending me all these books about food and wellness, and every book I kind of looked at and I was like, oh God, give me a break. And I threw it all, and they're all like, I mean, I still have all these books, but the majority of the books that I came across my desk that were books about food and wellness were so unappealing that I really wanted to open them, let alone cook out of them or really read them. I found that it was really there's a lot of the books came from sort of a preachy standpoint of, you need to stop doing this, you need to stop doing this, you need to stop doing this, you need to do exactly what I say. And it was sort of like, well, maybe that doesn't work for me, and maybe I don't want to give up this, and maybe I don't, I happen to love tomatoes, so why do I have to cut out nightshades from my life? And that's where I really started to think about, well, what if that food, we can think of food because it's what we put into our bodies, and pleasure and enjoyment that we get from food, does healthy food have to be unappealing? And that's when I started looking at all the different foods that I should be eating more of, that I noticed made a dramatic impact on how I felt. And they happen to be things that were really delicious, things that I wanted to cook with and I love to eat.
So what were the things that you did have to steer away, that's not to say eliminate, but steer away from? What were some of the things you realized were much less healthy than you had thought they were, or that you just thought these are things I should avoid?
Well, I mean, it was pretty obvious. I mean, there are things that are pretty, it's common sense, but it really comes down to putting it into practice. Obviously, refined sugars, anything you can't pronounce or you don't recognize, it's kind of like putting that away. Trying to reduce the amount of carbohydrates that I eat and add more cruciferous vegetables and it really it's about making decisions about the origin of the food, and the provenance is really is almost more important than actually what the food is. So it really was. To me, it was really enlightening. I had a moment where I was reading a wonderful book by the late Dr. David Sylvan Shriver called Anti-Cancer. And in that book, he did a tremendous amount of research about the effects of food and on the growth of cancer. And I was really shocked to learn that that you could have a steak from a conventionally raised feedlot cow, and it would be high in omega-6 fatty acids and low in omega-3 fatty acids and pro-inflammatory. And you could have a steak from a grass-fed, naturally raised cow, and it would have the exact opposite content. It would be high in omega-3 fatty acids and low in omega-6 fatty acids, and would be an anti-inflammatory food product. And to think that those two things, they're essentially the same ingredient, if you will, but from such remarkably different sources, would have absolutely polar opposite effects on the body. So it really, that was kind of at the source of what I was thinking.
Does that apply as neatly as that to other foodstuffs or other food categories where it's not the food item, but it's where you get it from and a whole bunch of other details about it that determine whether it's unhealthy or healthy?
It's really, I mean, that applies to a lot of foods.
Can you give some other examples?
Oh, eggs are a great example. Chickens are a great example. A lot of the fruit that we eat are good examples. Eating things out of season that have been, you know, when you have to consider off gases and you consider genetic modification, things like strawberries, the difference between a strawberry that we get at the green market in June or July that's beautiful and ripe and tart, and something that's, you know, has more of an apple consistency that you get from Driscoll in the middle of the winter. So I mean, it really, there are so many ingredients, and it really does come down to, and it can be a little dizzying at times, but it does come down to really thinking about where your ingredients come from.
How much can we trust labeling? I mean, when you talk about this, I realize we're looking for certain things on labels. Mm-hmm. Can we trust the way food is advertised to and labeled for us?
Well, there's a big business in this sort of natural labeling or natural foods, and it's amazing to look at the number of ingredients when you go into the supermarket that are touted as being natural. And I don't think there's anything natural about Hillshire Farms pork, but it says, you know, Hillshire Farms breakfast patty, and you have this kind of this bucolic image of a farm with a pig and all that. And, you know, so I think that labels can be very misleading. I think that a good word to look for is certainly pasture. Pasture raised means a lot. You know, if an animal has to walk around and has to search for some of its food, in all likelihood, it's going to be a smarter animal. It's going to be a healthier animal. It's going to be a better ingredient to eat. But yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of misleading information, and it can be very confusing.
There's been a lot of kind of debate, writing lately about the use of the term organic and what it does mean, doesn't mean, and the extent to which one should care. Do you have feelings? Yeah, as a result of your whole journey, do you have feelings about that and insights into the organic debate? Yeah,
I mean, I think that whenever possible, it's great to try to focus on eating organic foods. I certainly don't want to bring any more chemicals than are necessary into my body. But sometimes it's a matter of politics too, and one farm may not be able to afford going through organic certification, and in fact they're doing everything just as well as another farm that has organic certification. Or you know, if you go to Jolly Green Giant or Bird's Eye, and they've got their own organic line of foods, just because it's an organic line of food doesn't mean it necessarily is you're eating it in peak season, or it's as good a quality as something you'd be getting from a small local farm.
So a lot of these things that we hear a lot about, you know, eating seasonally, you know, the provenance of things, we shouldn't think of them as kind of elitist designations that have to do with taste. They actually have profound implications on the healthiness of that food.
Yeah, they have a lot to do with the actual nutritional quality and value of the food.
Talk about some of the recipes in here and how they grew out of your attempt to craft recipes that would directly address what you needed health-wise.
Well, as I said earlier, what I really wanted to do is I really wanted to create a book that wasn't just your typical cookbook. And my editor, Dorothy Kalins, who's here, was wonderful help in creating a book that wasn't just recipe photo, recipe photo, recipe photo. We didn't want something that was just stamped out and felt like it could be anyone's name and any replaceable recipes and ingredients. We really wanted the book to tell a story, and we wanted the book changed a lot. It changed as we worked on it, as it grew. It became sort of its own entity, and it had a very long life, much longer than we were anticipating, as books often do. But I think in having that long life, we really learned a lot about the direction the book needed to go in, and I really wanted this book to be about foods that you would want to eat, you'd want to cook, but at the same time sort of surreptitiously were doing the right thing for us. So my job as a cook, as a chef, is really primarily to make food that tastes really good, to make food that you want to eat, and that, to me, was kind of the maxim throughout the writing of the whole book, that needed to be the most important thing. And we tried to come up with a million different words for delicious, and Dorothy would always say, you can't say delicious here, you can't say delicious here. But that, to me, was really what it was about. It really had to be delicious. The dishes had to be craveable. They had to be sexy. They had to be food that you would want to cook and you'd want to eat. And then from that, they had to also be things that were doing the right thing for my body. And as I said before, it was this really beautiful, happy accident that so many of the things that I really loved cooking with, and that I already were already fundamentals of my cuisine, actually happened to be the right things for me to be eating. And I kind of tried to think of, I had one of those moments when I was going through all these horrible cookbooks that my mom had sent me that I didn't want to cook out of. They were all very exclusive. They were all very, or exclusionary. They said, don't eat this and cut this out and don't eat that. And from a kind of an emotional standpoint, that felt very restrictive, and it felt very negative. And I thought, well, I want food to be empowering. And that's where the notion of hero food coming from. I really want food to empower me, to make me feel better. I want to celebrate food, and it's hard to celebrate something that you're editing out of your life. So I thought, what if we think about it from more of an inclusive standpoint? Eat more of this and really love this, and think of this in a different way, and have some grilled kale, for instance. It doesn't have to always be stewed. Think of things in a different way, and incorporate more of these things into your diet. And that's kind of how the book sort of evolved.
What are in the category of more, what are some ingredients, things we see throughout this book that you wanted to bring more of into your life and that we'd all be wise to bring more of into our lives?
Anchovies. Yeah, the little fish with a big voice, anchovies, the one that, as I said, makes friends and enemies quickly. They're really wonderful. I mean, anchovies are great for a number of reasons. Olive oil. There are so many things that I think are really cornerstones of a healthy, anti-inflammatory, pro-immuno diet that you just can't have enough of, and certainly dark leafy greens, anchovies, garlic, ginger, all of these things are really good things. But I'm a big fan of anchovies.
And are they good for everyone? I mean, when you did a book, you came up with recipes that were particularly good for, you have a particular condition, rheumatoid, I can't even say it, arthritis.
It's not called RA.
You're dealing with inflammation. Mm-hmm. Will these be good for everybody, or have you also learned, are there other things these apply to?
Well, a big part of this book is I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a nutritionist. I'm a guy that cooks food and deals deals with inflammation. But I mean, I would wager to guess that pretty much everyone here in this room deals with inflammation on some level. Inflammation is really at the heart of pretty much every medical condition that we know of right now. And a lot of these conditions, the majority of these conditions, are very modern. And cancer is in many ways a very modern disease. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is a very modern disease. Many autoimmune diseases are modern diseases. Autism is a modern disease. These are things that certainly have existed throughout human history, but seem to exist in much greater numbers in the past 100 years, 50 years, since we've become a very industrialized, or since we've started consuming at an industrial level food. And there have been huge changes in our dietary patterns over the past 5,000 years as we've gone from becoming a sedentary agrarian society into becoming now an industrial society. This food is my experience. You know, this is what works for me, and it will not necessarily work for everyone, and not all of it will work for everyone, and some of it may work for some people, and some people may say, you know, I really can't deal with any peppers, or dairy is not good for me, it's very inflammatory. So it's my experience with food, and I don't suggest that this is a recipe for replacing medication. This book was never intended to be a medical tome. This was sort of about how food impacts how I feel. But there's a lot here that certainly applies to many medical conditions, whether it's Crohn's or type 2 diabetes. There are issues with inflammation. There's issues with insulin spikes that produce fat and inflammation that apply to nearly every medical condition. So there's a lot of value here for anyone who's concerned with how they feel, really. And that's the reason for the sort of subheader, the subtitle of the book is how cooking with delicious things can make us feel better. It's not just how it makes me feel, but when we're cooking with truly delicious things, when we're cooking with really good, well-sourced ingredients, it can make us feel better, and it does make us feel better.
And you've obviously, through the course of what you've been through, explored the kind of nexus of food and health. Do you have strong opinions on ways in which we're eating ourselves sick in the modern world?
Definitely.
And what are some of the main ways in which we're eating ourselves sick? And besides diabetes, which would be obvious,
sure,
the increase in that, what are some other things we see out there that are a direct result of the way we eat poorly?
Well, I think that almost any modern disease that we deal with, whether it's there's a lot of very, very compelling evidence that diseases like cancerous pathogens thrive when exposed to refined sugars. There's a huge impact on nearly any medical condition, modern medical condition, directly from the foods that we eat. And so many of the foods that we eat today are just so far removed from their natural state, if they ever in fact had a natural state, which is the other problem, is that a lot of the foods that we consume really never had a natural state. And they're so far removed from anything that we were intended through nature to consume. And certainly, our diet and our dietary habits have changed and evolved, and the way we eat, if you really think about it in terms of human history, for 99.5% of human history, we ate one way, and for 0.5% of human history, we've eaten a different way, and our bodies just haven't gotten a chance to adapt to it. But there's remarkable evidence. If you look at, for instance, obviously, and there's been lots of talk about Okinawa and Japan and the low rates of cancer in women in Japan. And then the rates of Japanese American women, cancer rates of Japanese American women being exactly the same as any other ethnicity in the U.S. So I have to think that it's pretty obvious that a modern diet, and when I say modern diet, a very post-industrial diet that we have, has a huge impact on our health. And you can look at any sort of modern, it's the wrong word to say, but primitive culture that has come into contact in the past 150 years with a Western European diet. They've experienced a huge increase in type 2 diabetes and cancer and all sorts of diseases that were virtually unknown, whether it's on Native American reservations here in the United States, or in Alaska, or in Samoa, or in, you name it. So I think there's a huge correlation between what we eat and what happens in our body, and that's undisputable.
What's a typical day of your eating like? Like, what do you eat for breakfast? And please don't say anchovies.
Anchovies.
I think for breakfast that would be a little intense.
No. Well, actually, one of my favorite things lately to eat for breakfast is scrambled eggs with anchovies and avocado. It's really, really delicious. Pardon the word, but no, it is.
Is that recipe in there?
There are recipes similar to that in there. Yes. I eat a lot of natural meat and grass-fed meat and fish. I eat a lot of dark vegetables. I try to eat things that are lower on the glycemic index. I do eat vegetables like beets and carrots, which are slightly higher, but I do try to stay away from processed food in general. If I could process it in the kitchen, then that's kind of as far as I want to take it.
I was going to say, how bound by all of this are you in terms of what you serve at Tertulia?
I try to keep things pretty close to. I mean, I think that you'd be amazed to see that a traditional Spanish diet is pretty close to what you should be eating in a lot of ways. And there really is in Spain, the way people the way moms have shopped has really only started to change recently. By default, Spain was way ahead of the curve with this notion of eating seasonally and eating locally, simply because people shopped in the markets, in the open air markets. And it's only been recently that the change to shopping in supermarkets, which has been slow to take off in Spain, has happened. So a lot of what we serve in the restaurant is pretty closely tied to what is in the book. I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable serving people food that I myself wouldn't be able to eat. So that's, it's really important to me that also, I feel a certain responsibility as well. I mean, I'm feeding a lot of people. I'm feeding 250, 300 people a day. I want to make sure that I'm feeding them good things and good ingredients. And I also want to be supporting producers that are doing the right thing, that are raising lamb and beef in a way that's ethical and sustainable and ecologically sound, but at the same time is also is good for us.
I always wonder, as more and more people become conscious of these things and more restaurateurs are searching for those ingredients, do we have enough producers of them, or is it becoming difficult?
Well, it isn't becoming difficult yet, at least at the restaurant level. I think it's challenging as in the city. In the city, we live in an incredible city, and we have access to so many things, and yet it's still. As a consumer, if I didn't have access to the purveyors that I have, I'm shocked at how difficult it is to get really good fish or really good meat. There are only a handful of good butchers in the city. There aren't that many. And if you compare this to a secondary city or something like, I don't know, Baltimore or Philadelphia, it'd be even more challenging. So it is. I think it is hard. And what it's the same thing with. We reach for processed carbohydrates because they're the easiest thing to grab, and they give us the quickest burst of energy.
And cheaper too, right?
And cheaper, and unfortunately, yes, they're cheaper. And that's what makes it very hard, and it does create a bit of this sort of elitism with food, and that it's prohibitively expensive, and most people can't afford to eat well. So it creates this very this kind of horrible vicious circle that where we have a nation of sickness in so many ways because all we can afford to eat is food that makes us sick.
Tertulia's been a huge success, right? It's matched all your...
Yeah, some would somewhere, yeah. It's so far so good.
So is there another restaurant in the works? What's on the horizon for you in terms of restauranting?
I mean, I'd certainly like to do another restaurant. I want to make sure that that Tertulia is a healthy and happy and sustainable business, and continues to be so. But I want to consider any restaurant opportunity cautiously and make sure that it's the sensible thing to do. But at the same time, I have an incredibly wonderful staff at the restaurant. We have great service staff. We have great guys in the kitchen, many of whom have been with me since the beginning of Boqueria. So it's 7 years. And at some point, good people want to go on to pursue their own thing. And the only thing that I can do really to keep that from happening is to create opportunities for them within. So eventually we do need to open another restaurant simply so that I don't lose the great people that I have. And you know, I'm excited to do that. I'm excited to grow in a way that's very cautious, but grow in such a way that I can create opportunities for people that have been with me for a long time. But I certainly want to make sure that it's the right step.
And do you think it would be another Tortuglia in a different section of town or a different city, or would you want to go with a whole different kind of restaurant?
No, I don't want to create another Tortuglia in New York City. I would consider possibly doing that in another market, but in New York, to me, it's also a very special restaurant. I was very involved in the design, and I can tell you every inch of the restaurant and why and everything exists within the restaurant, and it made it a very personal project in so many ways. It was the restaurant that I always wanted to build, but I never had been able to build before. So I think that doing another one here in New York would kind of cheapen that, and it also wouldn't be challenging. I'd like to do something else. I'd like to do something that pushes me to get better as a cook and pushes me to get better as a restaurateur, and that also is exciting for the people that I work with. To just hammer out the same exact thing over and over again, I think would be slightly boring. And there's a practical element to it, obviously. Right. And I think that having a metered balance between practicality and ingenuity and is important. But I would like to do something that continues to explore Spanish food in New York, but that perhaps highlights another avenue of some Spanish food that's not as well known.
So you would stick with Spanish. You don't, in the farther distant future, you don't see yourself trying a different ethnicity, or?
No, I mean, I don't really. This is what I cook. This is what I've been cooking for a really long time, and I've invested a lot of time and energy in it. And there aren't that many advocates of Spanish food and sort of ambassadors, if you will, of Spanish food. So I think it's definitely where my focus is, and it's where my focus will continue to be. At some point, if I have a restaurant empire and the means, and I have a very talented Indian chef who wants to open an Indian restaurant, then I'd certainly love to help he or she do that. But it wouldn't be my menu, and it wouldn't be my restaurant.
In terms of customer response to the restaurant, has there been anything since it opened that surprised you in terms of something they responded positively to much more than you thought they would, or something that didn't go over the way you were sure it would?
Well, I mean, the wood-fired grill has become something that's sort of a bit of it's kind of like the heart of the restaurant, and it's really important in Northern Spanish cuisine. You see every restaurant has a grill outside the restaurant, and you see the chefs running outside with a steak thrown on the grill, and then they come back inside and they goes to the kitchen and gets plated. And I really wanted to. I've always wanted to have a wood-fired grill in a restaurant in New York. It's very challenging because of the fire codes and everything. So we built the grill in the restaurant. We managed to go through all the hoops that we had to, thinking it would be somewhat of a novelty in a sense, that it would be, a great thing that we would do a few dishes on, but we didn't realize that nearly everything in our restaurant touches that grill at some point in its preparation. And, you really notice it. I mean, you'll have, if you haven't had the deviled eggs that we have here, you'll have them in a minute, and you'll see that there's just a terrific smoke that comes through from the grill, and even in the whites of the eggs, because we smoke the eggs gently inside the wood-fired grill. And it's become kind of this, this ephemeral kind of seasoning that weaves through the whole course of the food that we have. And it's this, this incredible seasoning, this spice that you can't quite touch and pick up on, but it really affects all the food. And that's something that has it was a bit of a surprise. I didn't think it was going to be nearly as fundamental to our cuisine, and it's also pushed us to learn how to cook with fire in a way that that is really, it's such a simple and primordial way of cooking, but we've found that it's also probably the most complex cooking medium ever. There's so many, it's so nuanced, and it's living, so you really have to tend it and observe it and be very, you can't really, you got to pay attention to what you're doing, or else it's up in flames.
I want to give everyone out there a chance to ask you whatever they want to. So I'm going to pass around this. So I'm going to give up this microphone, and if you have a question, I guess raise your hand. And
I will.
Great. Sure.
I love that you had a one-word answer when Frank asked you what we should be eating more of. And I wonder if you could use that as a launch pad in a way to talk about what's, the simple question is, what's so good about anchovies in every dimension? Like, I'm sure you're thinking of a lot of things when you say that it's the greatest food. And then the other question is, any anchovies, or what kind of anchovies?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, there are a number of reasons why anchovies are wonderful food. One, they're low on the food chain. So it doesn't take 50 years for an anchovy to mature. So in that sense, they're when sustainably harvested, they are a sustainable ingredient, just like anything else. They can also it can be abused, as it is. Anchovies have been overfished in many places as well. But they, unlike a bluefin tuna that takes many, many years to become mature, anchovies mature quite quickly. So in that sense, I think ethically it's a sensible food to eat. They're high in omega-3 fatty acids, which, as we know, is good for our brain. It's good for our joints. It's good for our immune systems. They are a great source of good fat, of HDL cholesterol, which is as important, if not more important, than having low LDL cholesterol for preventing heart disease. They're delicious. Also very important. We convert them into energy very efficiently and cleanly when we eat them, so they don't raise our glycemic index and cause an insulin spike the way that many grains do, or carbohydrates do, or sugars do. So in that sense, I'm not saying that they're a perfect food, but they certainly are something that you could live off of for quite a while. And they're good for your fingernails and your hair and all of those things, and your skin. And you don't need to eat them, and you can use a small amount of them to really make an impression on a dish that you're cooking. But that said, having any anchovy is not okay. You really need to there are a few people that do it properly. There are a few producers. Most of them are in northern Spain, where they have a tradition of worshiping the anchovy in a way that was somewhat unorthodox to me when I first got to Spain when I was 16, because anchovies had been the butt of so many jokes. And the one thing that I thought I would never actually like. And there are many anchovy detractors that I've found have changed their mind at our table because they've been introduced to anchovies in a way that they never thought of before. And anchovies they're preserved food. Generally speaking, the fish, because they do have so much fat in them, so much oil in them, they go rancid very quickly. So if you're very lucky to have them fresh, they're lovely, but they're not lovely after 2 or 3 days, and certainly after a week, they're not lovely at all. They stink up. So they really need to be preserved, and like so many other preserved foods, they're transformed by salt in a way that's really remarkable. And in fact, I would argue that they're improved by their preservation. But doing that, most anchovies that you find on the market, brands like Roland, for instance, they're preserved, and this notion that they're preserved, they go into a can and then they sit on a shelf for God knows how long. And just because they're preserved doesn't mean they actually last that long. They shouldn't really be around for more than a few months in a jar or in a can. So the good brands tend to be in glass jars where you can see them, and you can see that they're not deteriorating and broken apart. And without getting any kickbacks, I'll tell you, I think the best brands are Spanish brands. And there's a handful of Spanish brands from northern Spain where they go into the Bay of Biscay and they harvest, or off the coast of Galicia, and they bring the fish back, and they're processed immediately. So that's a big part of it. Making sure that they're processed quickly, they're processed by hand, they're processed by old ladies that know what they're doing, and they're really remarkable.
One brand name.
One brand name. Okay, I'll give you one brand name, but they're very expensive. Don Bocarde. They're beautiful, Don Bocarte, and you can buy them online, but you can also buy them at De España on Broome Street in Soho, and they have really, really great anchovies. Ortiz is also a very good brand, and both have different types of anchovies based on the size and based on where they're harvested from.
Anyone else? Here. I really enjoyed hearing about how you were a terrible student and how it sort of indirectly fueled your current success. I think a lot of people would enjoy hearing about that. So speaking of refined sugars, I really love the blueberry boy bait for breakfast. But for people like my boyfriend who really love the beans or who want these great anchovies, I'm wondering if there's anywhere besides like heritagefoods.com where you could source these great ingredients that we don't know about. Because, I mean, I know New York's a great place for these things, but if they're like secret sources that you have, that would be...
Well, I mean, as I said before, Despaña is really a great place to get so many different Spanish brand foods, whether it's dried beans or really good canned tuna, canned anchovies, almonds, things like that. Latienda.com is also a great place to get a lot of Spanish ingredients. And so many other things that I like to cook with that are really, things like the anchovies or almonds. Many of them are preserved foods that you can easily order from the internet. You don't have to necessarily be getting them fresh. So those are two sources that I would recommend.
Gives you a voice. So for those of us that aren't cooking every meal,
you just need to come to Tertulia. We're open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
So say I can't come to Tertulia for 3 meals a day. How can we order at a regular restaurant? I mean, I actually have psoriatic arthritis, which is very similar to what you have, but so I try to be gluten-free and, eat things from the earth, and I also love tomatoes, so I don't avoid nightshade vegetables as much as I should. But how can you order at a restaurant and not be like, oh, is this not inflammatory, or like, what are like some really simple things we can do to get good foods at other restaurants or when we, order delivery or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it can be very challenging, unfortunately, going to a restaurant and finding something that you are interested in eating and you're craving, but at the same time is not going to cause an inflammation or cause an inflammatory reaction. I think to your point about nightshades and tomatoes, I also love tomatoes, probably more than anything else. I love tomatoes and anchovies together. But I can also tell you that I haven't had a tomato in probably 2 months. And my feeling is, and I love corn too, but my feeling is that eat it when it's in peak season, and if you just eat it then and really celebrate it, there's also, there's a sense of joy which is very important too. I derive a lot of pleasure and joy from eating steamed corn on the cob in August. A lot of pleasure and joy. And that, I have to think that has an impact on how my body actually deals with inflammation. So I don't eat it the rest of the year, and I stay away from it. And I think that's kind of a good maxim to think about. To look at when you're looking at a menu, ask yourself, should I really be having gazpacho in January? I love tomatoes, but should I really have gazpacho in January? It might be time to eat some root vegetables. It might be time to eat some sweet potatoes. It might be time to have some Brussels sprouts. So really, think of things in those terms. I also encourage. I always encourage people to try to eat more fish. We, as a nation, we eat very little fish, and fish is a wonderful source of protein. Obviously, you try to eat it when you're in a reputable restaurant. And to take, I think if you take a minute to just kind of step back and ask yourself before you order food, is this going to be good for me or not? And if the answer is, well, I'm not really sure, then maybe you should pass on it. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about making a book about American hero food instead of food from Spain? Just to be curious.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of foods in the book, that a lot of recipes in the book that do reflect my American heritage, and certainly I actually don't think of myself as being a Spanish cook. I'm not Spanish, and I don't think of the food that I do at the restaurant as being necessarily traditional or authentic Spanish food. I'm cooking food in the language of Spanish cuisine. I'm using ingredients that are true to the flavor profiles of Spain, but I'm doing it in New York, where we have a completely different palate than people have in Spain, and where we have a completely different culinary experience. So our reference point and our understanding of what Spanish food is very different from that of someone who's living and eating in Spain. So I think that there are a lot of wonderful things here, ingredients that we have in the United States that are wonderful, that are great for us, that are terrific. All you have to do is go to the green market in the height of season, just right over here, and you see the bounty of what we have in the Northeast. And unfortunately, there are also a lot of American foods that are highly processed and overly sort of indulgent and not necessarily the right things that we want to be eating, although they can be very, very tasty. So, I think that I don't think that I'll do a book that is American hero food, but I do love a lot of the ingredients that we have here, and there's a huge opportunity to do whatever you like. I mean, the book is meant to be really a springboard, and I like to use recipes as inspiration, not necessarily as the roadmap for what I have to cook. And I love when I get tweets or emails from people all the time that say, oh yeah, I was cooking this dish from your book, and then I decided to try doing this, and I did it with that, and I didn't have this, so I tried that, and that's really what I wanted the book to be. I wanted it to be just kind of like a general guidebook, but to let you kind of do whatever you want with it, and what works for you.
Okay, one last question.
If I tonight should make one healthy, delicious, and cheap dish, what should that be?
How about a kale salad? A kale salad is very easy to make. Kale is a really, really great vegetable, and it's probably. I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything wrong with kale. So a simple kale salad would be my go-to. In fact, that's what I had for lunch today.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are selling.